Some bad news for La Tech football. Tulane and ECU, it was a heavyweight fight. We're talking about that, and we're giving our predictions for the games this coming weekend right now on the Louisiana Lunch Hour podcast. And welcome back to another edition of the Louisiana Lunch Hour podcast. Appreciate you listening in as always. If you haven't already, give us a follow on Spotify or check us out on the good old social media as well as YouTube. Just search Louisiana Lunch Hour. You'll get all the great stuff we've got on tap for you today on the pod. Again, we had a few Thursday games. We're going to get to those. I got to say, I think this is understatement of the century. Probably one of the weirdest games I've seen all year for any team, really. And it's Tulane taking on ECU. Tulane wound up coming away with a very nice 26-19 win thanks to a last-minute touchdown following a field goal to tie it up at 19-all. And this is a Tulane team that took almost the entire game to score a freaking touchdown. The first half, all they scored were field goals, 4 of them. They were up 12-0 at the half. Yeah, you heard that right. You only had 4 field goals for much of the ball game. You didn't score your first touchdown until the fourth quarter. And that was to take a 19-16 lead. If that was the final score, I wouldn't be surprised if that was a college football scoreagami type game. It was just disappointing to see. In fact, after the game, the head coach, he was not happy. And justifiably so. 11 penalties for 96 yards, especially on 2 of the last 3 plays of the game were pass interference penalties, and both of them were pretty justified. In fact, the second one was kind of just, I wouldn't necessarily call it. But then again, I'm not a referee. I just see that. I was like, whoa, this was surprising. And considering they scored with 35 seconds left in the game, kickoff was returned for some reason. I don't know why they didn't just, take a touchback. Then you have a nice 22-yard pass to get you near midfield, pass interference, incompletion, then another PI that results in an automatic first down. And then a Hail Mary pass into the end zone, incomplete. And Tulane just comes away with a win, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. Because again, they did not look good on the whole. Jake Retzloff, he looked better than he has all year in terms of the passing game. 347 yards, 2 touchdowns. But even then, your run game was virtually non-existent. Your leading rusher had 34 yards off of 10 carries. That's not going to get anything done. Again, passing game finally showed up, but you couldn't get anything done in the red zone. I was seeing quite a few of those red zone opportunities, and those just ran away from you. 3 of 10 on third down. That's not great for any team. Hopefully they can kind of get it right, because they were able to hold a very good offense down. I think that's the biggest positive you can take away from this, is that you held a really good offense led by Caton Hauser, or Catan Hauser, I don't know how to pronounce the name, 180 yards passing. Their leading rusher only had 52 yards, and you just handled business the right way on the defensive front. There were no turnovers, which was kind of surprising, but you still got some good hits in there. You got some good sacks from your defense. 3 sacks on the evening. A lot of TFLs in there as well. So there were some positives to take away from it, but you still had way too many penalties. It was like watching the New Orleans Saints early on in the year. A lot of, issues. Again, I'm glad they won, but it's a little disappointing, to say the least, to see Tulane be in that kind of dogfight on a Thursday night. Hopefully there's not too many of those wild and wacky Thursday night games the rest of the way, because if there are, we're going to be in for a long season. All right, and we got to talk about that La Tech game last night as well. It was disappointing to say the least. I think that's an understatement of the century, because this was a game where on paper, it looked like La Tech was going to win this game in a very competitive ball game, but I think they were still going to win. That was not the case. We saw an outright ass whooping, and it's more because of what happened in the game itself. Blake Baker went down early, and from there the wheels came off. He got injured on the drive before Kennesaw State marched down the field with a 15-play drive off of a punt, 92 yards down the field, eating up 6 minutes off the clock. Then on the next drive for La Tech, they throw an interception. Yes, Trey Kukuk, he threw an interception that was returned all the way to the to the La Tech 9. Think about that. Actually, let me correct myself here. It was returned 29 yards, and then there was a horse collar tackle. I mean, I can't speak today. That wound up getting Kennesaw State, the Owls, over at the 9-yard line of La Tech. That is unacceptable. And then you have Gabriel Bernard run for 9 yards into the end zone to take a 14-7 lead. And again, from there, it was just lopsided as all get out. A poor game all around for La Tech. Again, when you lose your starting quarterback, it's going to hurt. For what it's worth, he was 6 of 11 for 46 yards. And then you put in Evan Bullock for the bulk of the game just to kind of figure some things out, because the one completion that Trey Kukuk had was 11 yards. You had Bullock looked a little bit better, 111 yards off 11 completions and in an interception. But Dexter Williams, without a doubt, the big headline that a lot of people are going to be taking away from that nationally televised game on ESPNU, with 4 touchdowns, 284 yards through the air. And he also got about 5 yards rushing off of 6 carries. And this was a wet game towards the end of it. So you can about imagine, I think Sonny Cumbie's probably frustrated. And again, it's one of those things you didn't necessarily expect to see in this one. I believe a couple weeks ago I said this could have been a game where the wheels start to fall off for La Tech after a really good start to the season. I was starting to believe the hype a little bit, but when you lose your starting quarterback, it's going to hurt a lot. You know, losing that, and more importantly, not being able to get your offense to work at a very consistent level, just did you in. Not a whole lot of defensive stats to speak of. Overall, just a fairly mediocre game from La Tech that got out of hand very quickly because of some big swings. Again, they scored 14 points in the second and final frames of the game, and that was more than enough to handle business, because that offense, after losing Blake Baker, became very impotent. Still, just very disappointing performance, and I thought I'd expect more out of the Bulldogs. Hopefully they can kind of regroup and revamp things heading into their next contest. And now we're going to get into some of the big games going on this weekend across the state of Louisiana. We're going to start off with LSU taking on South Carolina. A big game for a lot of reasons, because I think LSU needs to prove that, what happened last week against Ole Miss was a fluke. Blake Baker's healthy, ready to go. You have to prove yourself in this one. If you lose this game, I think the fan base is going to start turning on Brian Kelly even more so, especially if we see, Garrett Nussmeier underwhelm. If it still looks like he's hurt in this game, that's going to be at 6:45. It's going to be a bloodbath if we see that situation happen. I'm not going to say this is what's going to happen. It just feels like, to me, there's going to be a fan base that's not going to be happy when they get right down to it. Then you have South Carolina. South Carolina is a team that heading into the year had a lot of hype. And that's kind of strange to think about because South Carolina probably over the last, 10, 15 years hasn't had a whole lot to be excited about. But here we are. You've got Lenore Sellers, a guy that everybody had been hyped up on. In fact, I was seeing several mock drafts saying back in August, September, which I still don't understand the concept of doing those things. But he was projected to be a number one guy. And LSU has shown themselves to at least somewhat struggle with a dual threat quarterback. We saw it with Trinidad a couple weeks ago against Ole Miss. Hopefully they can kind of get that organized. But also, you've got to have that offensive line get better. I guarantee you that's the biggest reason why this LSU team has been failing at an alarming rate is because your offensive line has not been able to stop the run very well. We've had an extra week to look back at film, and we can all see plain as day that is the number one problem this purple and gold team has. And you can prove me wrong. I want to see LSU win. And I'm going to go ahead and predict LSU to win, but it will be very close. I'm going 28-24. That's kind of the type of game I expect this to be. Very tight, but LSU squeaks away with a nice win to help kind of improve their chances. Again, I said it earlier this week, is that LSU has every chance to achieve all of their goals, which is saying something because I don't think any of us expected to see that early on this season, especially that loss to Ole Miss. It hurt a lot. It hurt your chances, but with everybody else kind of falling out, I mean, you have Texas. They're out of the top 25. Penn State, who was undefeated, lost to UCLA just last week, a team that has an interim head coach, and they just dropped out of the top 25. You got a lot of madness going on in October. We're starting to see the cannibalization of the SEC in full effect. If LSU just handles their business, they've got every bit of an opportunity to achieve their goal of getting to the college football playoff. Even if they're a two-loss team, let's just say they lose to Texas A&M, and Texas A&M continues to be the team that they have shown themselves to be early on. As somebody who's not necessarily the biggest fan of them, I hope that's not the case. But if they continue to be a top-flight performer, I think LSU could get in because of a quote-unquote quality loss. Now we'll flip it over to the Sun Belt Conference with the Louisiana Raging Cajuns on the road at JMU. This is a massive spread. If you were a gambling man or a gambling gal, this is the game you need to keep an eye on. I'll go with James Madison winning, but I was looking at some of the lines earlier in the week, and they were extremely, extremely lopsided. And at the time of this recording, the Cajuns are currently 17.5-point dogs. I would say Cajuns cover that if you place plus 17.5 right now on DraftKings. No sponsored ads for that. I'm just saying that's kind of the best lines I think you can get right now for the bang for your buck. Because I would not be surprised if the Cajuns win the game, lose the game, but cover by 17 points. I just feel like this Cajuns team can at least somewhat keep it competitive with Lunch Winfield. Can they pull off the massive upset to stay undefeated in Sun Belt Conference play and, more importantly, keep your goals out in front of you? I'm not necessarily sure, but this will be a true test for Lunch Winfield. He is going to be thrown into the fire in a big way, and it kind of reminds me of about, I'd say, 10 or so years ago when Brandon Harris was thrown into a similar situation. He was thrown to the fire and he kind of got burned. And I'm hoping that's not the case for Lunch Winfield, because this team needs their quarterback, their QB1, to show up and shine out in a big way. And hopefully, I'd say the big head doesn't get to Winfield, because he's been getting a lot of good pub lately. He's been out, getting those NIL deals, being part of stuff with Eat Lafayette, which is tremendous. but can he kind of keep his head in the game and be locked in, as the kids like to say? Then we got UL Monroe at Coastal Carolina. UL Monroe has looked pretty good this year. I got to give them a ton of credit. And again, as a Cajuns, as a UL Lafayette alumni, that's kind of tough to say right here, right now, that, oh, hey, I think UL Monroe's a pretty good team. Definitely kind of leaves a sour taste in my mouth. But up in Conway, South Carolina, I think anything can and will happen. Because I think UL Monroe, they want to get the bad taste out of their mouth after what happened this past weekend against Northwestern. This could be a perfectly good palate cleanser against a 2-3 Chanticleers team that I think has seen better days. I think I got to go with UL Monroe winning that one. Going to be a fun ball game, though. Can't wait to see what happens there. Then we have Northwestern State at Houston Christian. I got to give the slight edge to Northwestern State. They've eventually got to get the monkey off their back again. I don't think we're going to see them lose yet another ball game. That's the only team in the Southland going at it this weekend. Now we got some SWAC action. Southern at Bethune-Cookman. Southern has not looked good all season, and I'm not going to throw anything towards them. Bethune-Cookman, I fully expect them to handle business against this Southern Jags team that is kind of underwhelmed. They haven't been able to kind of figure out the QB1 situation. A lot of other things going on there. And we said a couple weeks ago, I think Terrence Graves, his days may or may not be numbered. Grambling, on the other hand, they're taking on Texas Southern. I got to go give a slight edge to Grambling here. I believe that team has a very good chance to get some spectacular things done for the rest of the season. I don't know if their goals are in front of them at this point, but I would definitely say, a win here would help kind of quiet some of the boo birds, at least somewhat. Meanwhile, you got the New Orleans Saints taking on the Patriots. This is how we're going to wrap up the pod today on a big old Friday. And this is another big game because I think this is a prove it game for Spencer Rattler to prove that it's not just a fluke. You look at this season so far, I was seeing on Twitter, some people were bringing up a poll about how they would grade Spencer Rattler's performance through 5 games. And people have a ton of good responses. Some were saying it's a B+ performance, a B+ player. I'd agree with that, especially when you look at the overall numbers. He kept it competitive in the first 2 games against Arizona and San Francisco, which looks to be a very tough division to come out of. Then you get your butt handed to you by Seattle. That's not a good look. And mind you, I think that was just a lot of elements that weren't the quarterback's fault that resulted in that incredibly lopsided ball game. But now you got back into the rhythm, and more importantly, you finally got to win. That was the biggest thing. You got the monkey off your back if you're the New Orleans Saints. You kept it very competitive, way more than probably people thought you were going to against the Buffalo Bills. If not for some plays going the wrong way, you probably could have won that ball game. And that would have been a massive upset that changed a lot of things. At the same time, though, you're playing against a Patriots team that you haven't been able to kind of get the best of over the last few seasons. Because it feels like since Drew Brees has left, because Drew Brees definitely had a pretty solid record against one of the greatest players of all time in Tom Brady. Last time these two teams played, Saints whipped their backside, but it's because Mac Jones looked like an absolute jamoke. I'll never forget that kind of game. That said, I'm going to give a slight edge to the New England Patriots here, simply because it's another kind of difficult game. This Patriots team just beat the Buffalo Bills. Just by law of averages, I think this Patriots team is a little bit better than the Saints are. And a couple weeks ago, they just crushed the face in of the Carolina Panthers, who I would say the Saints are, relatively speaking, on the same level of expectations. The Panthers are in the middle of like year 20 of a rebuild. Because after Cam Newton's like 2015 season, that team fell off a cliff very quickly. And after Drew Brees left the franchise and retired alongside Sean Payton exiting stage left and eventually going to the Denver Broncos, that team didn't fall off a cliff, but you could definitely say they stumbled a few steps down back towards those 7 and 9 years, because the Saints have never been deliberate tankers. You go look at the history. They have never necessarily tanked on purpose. They just tanked because they were that bad. They were that tremendously awful. And that's what we saw last year with that Saints team. I think this year's team is a little bit better, but more importantly, Spencer Rattler is getting better as the season progresses. I want to see more of Rashid Shaheed, what he can do. I want to see how Spencer Rattler looks. I want to see how Kellen Moore looks as the season improves. And somebody said it the other day. This team may be like ass and be 1-4 to start the season, but they're probably the most entertaining Saints team they've seen in years. And I'd agree with that. But I think it also speaks to something else that I said on social media, is the fact that when you look at everything and you go into a season with very little expectations and you don't just want to see your team win the Super Bowl, I think you get very entertained. You can be entertained easily by seeing a Saints team actually play, and it just feels entertaining. Like you're not living and dying off of every like score or penalty. Yes, you're going to get frustrated when your team doesn't win, but if you go into a season not thinking, oh, hey, we're going to win the Super Bowl, and they don't, you kind of feel like, okay, we're fine. And as long as you're willing to embrace that rebuild, it's going to be all good. It's going to be all good. And you know what else is all good? Doing this podcast. Appreciate you listening. And we'll be back with you on a Monday, recapping everything that happened over the course of the weekend. Hope you have a great rest of your Friday. We'll catch you next time on the Louisiana Lunch Hour podcast.